Hi folks, I'm Richard Duby, and this is Think About It. Today my guest is a very old friend of mine, somebody I've known since childhood, Joe Meyer. And Joe, first off, I want to thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
The reason that Joe is here is that Joe is the only person I know who lived for an extended period of time on mainland China. And we're going to talk about what got him there, what in his life perhaps enabled him to relocate to mainland China and live there for 32 years. So Joe, let's begin. You and I have known one another since childhood.
We have.
I know your family. Do you feel that your family, the folks within your family, prepared you in any way, either, and we talked about this, either nature or nurture, for being able to make the move to a country like China?
Yes, they did. My parents were very open people. They had rich life experiences. They were not closed off people. They enjoyed life. They had, in their own particular experiences and upbringing, very different paths, which was interesting to me as a child and as a young adult, because it made me part of two different kinds of worlds. My mother was a rural coal mining village person, and my father was an urban New Yorker.
Your mother's family were, I take it, not an affluent family, that there was?
No, they were a lower middle class,
okay,
small town, southeast Ohio, coal mining Ohio.
Okay, and your dad's family?
My dad was the son of a very successful entrepreneur in New York and grew up with an upper middle class.
Okay, now you being the product of two people from disparate backgrounds, I hate to refer to this as a mutt, but you know, you're coming together with the strengths of both. Do you feel that hybrid vigor, so to speak, is something that allowed you to, in later life, develop an open outlook to what's going on in the rest of the world?
Yes, I do, because my mother was a Catholic and my father was a Jew, and neither of them took religion as a big part of their life.
Okay.
I grew up with a familiarity with two distinct cultures, but not a dominance by either.
Yeah.
So it allowed me to choose my own way in growing up, in following my own lights.
Okay, so there was nobody that you felt the pressure steering your course as to where you had to go?
No, my mother came from a motherless family. Her mother died when she was very young, so she had no model other than her own mind to raising children. She had 5 good children.
Yeah.
And my father came from a family of a dominant man.
Okay.
And he told me later in life, he said, I told myself I would never impose upon you what you should do. You make your own decisions.
Okay, so let's skip some time here. You and I went through grammar school and high school together. You leave high school, and what do?
I went to college,
Mm-hmm.
and I continued on in college for almost 8 years, undergraduate and graduate.
And what was the graduate degree?
Because of the times we lived in,
Yeah.
Asia was a very big part of our lives. I matured in my study of political science into a more specific concentration on modern Asian history, particularly Chinese history and language.
Okay, so I'm going to walk back a little. When we were growing up, when we were in high school, you displayed an interest in China even back then. Can you recall why?
Yes, we grew up in that 50s and 60s, in which communism was a big part of our understanding of the world, or lack of understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And what was communism? Who were they? Clearly the Russians, the Soviets were a big part of that, but I seem to be more fascinated by the Chinese example because it was more raw. And as I perceived later, it was very much in concert with their very long history.
Okay, so when we were in high school, were you beginning to focus on Chinese history, or did that come later on?
In high school?
Yes.
No, in high school I was looking more at the Americans. I did not have an international perspective per se at that young age. American politics, and we were beginning the civil rights struggle. We were, of course, involved in European and Asian affairs. I was looking at it from the point of view of my own locality and my own politics.
Were you interested in American history at that point?
Not really.
Okay.
Not
good.
really. I was familiar with it because our education was more or less slanted toward that.
Yes.
So I did not feel any compunction to get deeply into that.
Okay, so now you're out of graduate school. I take it you're looking for employment. What happens then?
Well, as I got out of grad school, I looked at the world around me, and after the obligatory European trip as a young person, because the Vietnam War was going on, and I wanted to stop that as soon as possible, I associated myself with a couple of political candidates at the national level, trying to win elections to stop the war.
Let's dig into that a little bit. What political candidates were you?
I started out with McGovern.
Okay.
I took responsibility for the central part of New York State in the primaries.
Okay.
For McGovern in the CDs 33 and 32, and then in the general election I handled Long Island.
Okay, but then you and I know this history, but then you actually are employed in Congress in some.
Going back a few years,
Yeah.
I was lucky because my uncle, from my mother's side of the family, her older brother, was a congressman in the Republican Party.
Right.
In the 85th Congress from Southeast Ohio.
Okay.
So that corresponded to my first 2 years of college in Washington, D.C.
Right.
So my education in that time was on the Hill.
With
my uncle. I was serving as a congressional aide.
And you were also working within the Goldwater.
He because he was a Republican, he was able to get me an invitation to work in the 1964 Goldwater Republican National Convention operation in the Cow Palace in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So his daughter and I, we drove across the country, and we located in San Francisco, south of San Bruno, I think it was, and I reported for duty with this letter of introduction to Goldwater. I had known Goldwater a little bit in Washington, and began working as a press aide.
So here we have this young man with, I think we could fairly say, Democratic leanings.
Certainly not conservative Republican leanings.
Yes, working for, at that time, the archetypical conservative Republican Barry Goldwater. Okay,
Right.
as part of your education. We're going to leap forward now. You're basically done with your political career in Congress. What are the next steps? Where are you going?
Well, during all this period, international activities continued to take place, and I was very interested in them.
Yes.
And the Vietnam War did wind up between 73 and 75. So I was able to apply for a low-level job in what they call the UNDP, United Nations Development Program,
Right.
headquartered in New York. Because I had language skills in Spanish and Chinese, it was easy.
Let me just interrupt you there. How did you develop your Chinese language abilities?
Oh, I studied in college and grad school.
Okay.
I did 4 years
Go ahead.
of Chinese language study.
Okay.
So I had a fairly good grasp of academic Chinese. My reading wasn't great, but my writing wasn't great. My reading was okay, but the speaking was fluent enough to be conversant.
And please tell our audience, you speak about academic Chinese. There's something other than academic Chinese.
Moving just quickly ahead, when I first went to China, I was able to have a reasonable conversation about political economy, but I didn't know how to ask where the bathroom was. so I had to learn the street language.
Okay, so we're going to go back now. So you're now with the UN.
Yeah.
And what is your role and where are you going?
So I spent a few years in New York with the UNDP in executing projects in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Basically, the projects are defined goals to be executed within a particular country.
Yeah.
A budget is given by the UNDP based on contributions from contributing nations, and monitoring those funds and the outcomes of those projects was my job.
Where are you located?
Up until 1980, between 75 and 80, I was located in New York. And then in 1980, I was fortunate enough to be selected to help open the UNDP office, or the UN office, in Beijing, China.
Okay, so now you're in Beijing, right? And what is it like for an American first time entering China? We're talking about mainland China here. What is that transition physically and emotionally like for you?
Well, it's a long trip for one.
Yeah.
In those days, the airplanes didn't go very as long as they go now. So it was like a 24-hour trip.
Okay.
In the air. But when I got there in mid '80, I was given a specific responsibility within the UNDP. So I immediately went to work, and I was given housing, so that was easy to live. But the question you asked is what it's like to be an American, a foreigner in China at that time. There was a great division between us from abroad and the people on the street.
I think more than that, what I was asking is, I imagine that an American entering mainland China is like you picture a huge door slamming behind you, for dramatic effect. Did you feel a sense of isolation? Did you feel a sense of being separate? Did any of that grab you when you entered?
Yes, you're as a non-Chinese or non-Asian, you're the subject at that time of incessant staring.
Yeah.
People looked at you intently because they never saw. The key element is the bridge of the nose. If you have a bridge on your nose, you're a very strange person to the Chinese.
Really?
Yes. And so noses are important. Young children would stare because we just were not in the facial recognition set that they had.
Did that bother you?
It intrigued me. It didn't bother me. I'm a New Yorker.
Yeah.
I grew up in a cosmopolitan place, so I was used to people from everywhere.
Sure, but
when I was there, it was homogenous. There were no people except Chinese.
But you and I, in this country, are at the top of the sociological food chain. We're white males in this country. Yeah, with education in this country. You're over there, you're suddenly a minority. And not just a minority, but a minuscule minority. What's it like being a minority? Because truthfully, I've never been a minority. I just never have. It hasn't occurred to me yet. What's it like being a minority in a country that is not particularly enamored with Americans to start off with? What's that like? Is there?
You're invisible, and the analogy to minorities in the United States being invisible people is very clear. The difference is that being a minority of European descent in China, you are such a minuscule number that it's not a social fact. It's a physical fact.
It's a physical fact.
There's no discrimination. I could do what I wanted in China as long as I respected the rules and the laws. There was no implicit or explicit limitation on what a European could do because they're Europeans.
So there's no fair comparison between the societal reference to minorities in this country and a minority in China. And minorities in this country are subject to extreme prejudice. They are treated as the lowest on the social ladder. But in China, being as I said, a minuscule minority, there isn't that. That doesn't exist.
Well, there are 55 minority tribes in China, and the majority tribe is called the Han people. That's a designation that they've used historically for many, many centuries, eons. And if you are a member of the Han, you are part of the 95% of the population.
Okay.
The other 5% is the 55. So the closest analog that the Chinese people would have would be to see me as a person from West China, the Xinjiang region.
Okay.
I would have wavy hair, a bridge on my nose, and maybe a different pallor to my skin.
So until you opened your mouth and they could detect that you had
I
an
sometimes
accent.
introduced myself as a Xinjiang.
Really?
As a Xinjiang person.
And it was fine.
It was a way to fit in to their stereotypes,
Yeah.
so that they didn't have to ask about me.
Huh.
But I did that infrequently. I was always an American.
Well, within societies, various societies around the world, there are, for lack of a better term, there are caste systems, so that even native-born people, indigenous people, are treated differently depending on. Did that exist in China?
Oh yes, yes. One of the great accomplishments of Mao's revolution was to level the society. That you were a worker or a peasant or a soldier, and all of these were highly respected within the society. And whether your grandfather was a landlord or a businessman or an academic or whatever, and some points maybe give you a problem. But at the time I was there in the 80s, beginning in the 80s, men and women were very equal.
Okay.
You were never, if you associated with somebody with dirty hands, they were a laborer, that was not a point against you.
That
They
wasn't a
were
negative.
accepted in society just as anybody else.
Okay, so let's move ahead a little bit here. You're with the UN. Okay, how long were you in that position?
I stayed in China in the UN for about 4.5 years.
And then what?
And then I was very fortunate to have met a wonderful woman in China.
Yes.
And we married. She came from a family of musicians.
And I'll do an aside here. I know Joe's wife very well, and he's seriously married up. Go ahead.
I agree. UNDP was an excellent organization, but you were never going to get rich.
Right.
My maximum salary was in the neighborhood of $10,000 a year. So once I had aspirations to make a family, I had to look for different kinds of jobs.
And what was Sue doing at this time, your wife doing at
She's
this time?
always been a college teacher. She's always
Okay.
been a teacher of either English or Chinese.
And I take it that the salary that she was being paid was not something that could cause people to say you married her for her money.
I should have, but no, she was making 56 yuan a month, which
Which
was at an exchange rate of 1.5 to $1. So she would make about $20 a month.
Well,
Yeah,
okay, so now you and Sue are married.
yeah.
You are thinking about leaving the UN position because you can't afford to raise a family on that.
And I was going to be transferred to
And
another site.
Okay, and you were going to be transferred. What's your next step?
I looked around the landscape in China for companies, European and American, who were trying to set up operations. China, at that time, was still coming out of its isolation.
Okay.
So companies were very tentative about setting up.
Yes.
And I was very happy and very fortunate to meet some very nice people from a major U.S. retailer,
Okay.
Sears Roebuck and Company, who had ambitions to both buy and sell in China.
Okay.
Buy things for the store and also maybe sell things that they could acquire from other countries.
And what was your position with them?
I was the representative. I was the only Sears man in China.
And
There were Sears operations in Hong Kong and Taiwan, which were total buying operations,
yeah,
which had been in existence for many, many years.
were you a one-man operation?
I was a one-man operation.
You were it.
I was it in the confines of mainland China.
And how long did that last?
In various iterations, almost, let's see, 6.5, 7
Okay.
years.
So now, during this time that you are the sole representative of Sears, you're stationed in mainland China. You
I
are
am, Beijing.
you are living.
Well, I
in
started
Beijing.
out in Beijing.
Okay. When that terminates, when Sears terminates, what's your next position, and did you remain in Beijing?
So I was in the beginning of '89. Sears was improving its buying operations in China. Things were starting to cook, and China was becoming very open, and so they asked me to move to Taiwan, to Taipei,
Okay.
and that would be more in the fall period of '85.
Had you been to Taiwan before?
I had actually, as a student in 1966 on my own. I went to Taiwan to begin studying Chinese.
Okay, and we're gonna go back. We're gonna flash back for a second. When you're on Taiwan, Taiwan was a real central R&R facility for soldiers who were serving in Vietnam. Were you exposed to the soldiers who were resting there, relaxing there?
Well, in '66, when I was between my junior and senior years of college, I did go to Taiwan with the hope of going to China.
Mm-hmm.
But as people may know, in '66, that was the beginning of the Chinese great cultural proletarian revolution.
You're talking about Tiananmen Square?
No, this is Mao's complete shakeup of the party and the society.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Between 1966 and 1976, and so entry for an American at that time was prohibited. I couldn't get in. So I spent about 3 months in Taiwan at that time, and America still maintained a military presence at those years in Taiwan and served as an R&R base for American soldiers in Vietnam. And the reason I went to Taiwan, as I mentioned before to you, was because I wanted to understand the context of the American operation in Asia, in Vietnam. Why were we there?
Yeah.
So Taiwan was the closest I could get. I didn't want to go to Vietnam, or probably couldn't go to Vietnam. I never served in the army or in the government.
What did you learn from these men who were resting there?
These were young guys, my contemporaries,
In their 20s.
In their 20s, who were going through hell.
Yeah.
And they came to Taiwan, found a couple girls and some drink, blotted their minds, and went back. And they had no idea what they were doing.
And how did this affect your feelings about not just American involvement in Vietnam, but America's involvement in the world at large, particularly Asia?
Well, a perception was growing in my head. I can't say it was mature, but it was growing. That, in Taiwan, you met a lot of people who were from the mainland, who
Yeah.
had gone through World War II and post-war period. So they were very interesting people. That what America was doing in Vietnam was predicated on the experience during World War II in China. So I began to focus on the evolution of American policy in the 30s and 40s as it grew in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
So those young soldiers certainly helped inform me.
Okay, so we're going to have to hopscotch a little here simply because we have the effects of time playing on us. So now you're with Sears, and you're with Sears for a period of
about 6.5, 7 years.
Okay. What occurs, and you're married.
Married with children.
With children, and
2 lovely girls who were born in the States but raised in the Chinese.
In
context.
Chinese. So what happens next? Where do you move to next after that?
Well, Sears contracted. As you know, it's almost disappeared by now, but at that time it began its contraction because of a small company in Bentonville, Arkansas called Walmart.
Yeah.
And as a buyer, as running the buying operation, I had contact with some very professional marketers and merchants, and one of them I chose to work with in the hand tool industry. So I began in 91, 92 to work with a U.S. company that was making wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers,
Right.
hammers, for Sears and for others. And they had been making in Taiwan and in Japan, but they wanted to develop sources in the China. So I joined them, and my job was to scout out and develop factories in China that could handle these metallurgical issues and produce at a quality that would be acceptable to the American and European consumer.
And at that time, you are making a salary that is probably more than the average Chinese citizen was making at that time?
Per day.
Yeah.
I would make more in a day than they would make in a year.
Okay, and that afforded you the ability to, I'm not saying move around more easily, because I understand that there were certain constraints that were, you're still an American and living in China, right?
I can go pretty much anywhere I want. I'm not a political player in
Right.
China or the United States, so, and I have no government affiliations. So dealing with light industrial production in China, I could go anywhere I wanted as long as I was looking for factories that could sell to the international market.
Beneficial to both.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question about an event that occurred while you were there, and that I just alluded to before, was at Tiananmen Square. When Tiananmen Square occurred, what impact did it have on you, and what impact did it have on your family? Not, when I talk about your family, I'm talking about Sue and the girls. I'm not talking about an extended family. In the sense that, did you feel any sense of being less safe or less at home, or did it affect it in any negative way?
No. The immediate effect was the planned transition from Beijing to Taiwan, to Taipei, took effect. I was supposed to go in September or October to take over the buying office in Taipei, and I moved because of the Tiananmen in June. I left in June.
Now, but you say Tiananmen Square affected that change. Why? What? I mean, I understand what took place, the turmoil. Did the company feel?
The company had a policy that if there was civil disturbance, that the staff members, the international staff members, had to leave.
So you're now back on Taiwan?
I went to Taiwan.
For how long?
For a couple of years. I stayed in Taiwan for a couple of years, and as I said,
same company.
Same Sears, Roebuck and Company,
Yep.
And because of the retail market and the accelerating implosion of Sears in the American domestic market, by 91, Sears was not a viable employer anymore for
What's
me.
your next step then?
So as I said, I joined a company that had been a supplier to
Right.
Sears of metal hand tools.
And how long were you with that company?
About 5 years.
Where were you then?
Oh, I was in Hong Kong. I chose to live in Hong Kong because my kids were now of school age, and we looked at the educational opportunities in China, in Shanghai and Beijing, Guangdong. But I think the best option was for them in Hong Kong. So I lived in Hong Kong with my kids, but I did my work in the mainland.
Okay, so the girls basically grew up
In Hong Kong.
in Hong Kong. And did the girls travel a lot out of country, or did they stay with you and Sue mostly?
We made frequent trips because Sue's family is from Beijing.
Yes.
So we would always go to visit the family.
Okay.
And bring your kids to work. I would always bring my kids along with me on factory trips if I could, so that they would get to see what a forging press is, or a cast iron is, or how a motor is made. They've been through a number of factors.
So now we're getting to the point, unfortunately, where we have to start thinking of the end here. You decide to come home, and I take it from conversations we had, the girls are going to college. You and Sue are back there, and you decide to come back to the States.
Well, there's a long time. The kids went to college, but we stayed on working. My wife worked in the university. She was a teacher, and I worked for a number of trading companies. They called them trading companies because they had intimate knowledge of retail customer requirements and demands in Europe and the United States, in Australia and Japan. And we could design and manufacture products that met these growing demands. You know the common consumer perception now and in the past number of years that just about everything you buy is made in China. Well, I was at the ground floor of that operation.
Of that revolution.
Right.
So you come back to the States. You had been back to the States many times, so you weren't suffering culture shock, so to speak, because you had been back to the States, but you did have to acclimate.
Oh, yes.
And was that a lengthy, was it a more lengthy process than acclimating to life in China?
Hard question. After having spent so much time in China and with the modern communications and ease of travel, even though I'm physically here in the States most of the time, my mind is never far away from there. So it's not an acclimation so much as an inclusion.
Well, most of your adult life was spent in China.
Yeah.
So we are going to have to wrap this up because we are limited to our 30 minutes. But I could go on with you for another 30 minutes very, very easily, and I hope that our audience found it just as interesting and exciting as I did.
Good.
And folks, that's it for us for this session of Think About It. I do hope you will join us for our next, and I hope you take some interesting information from Joe here, and you do think about it, and we will see you at the next episode. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you.
Open up your eyes, it's all brand new.